On January 6, 2026, just after 8:40 in the morning, a quiet exchange took place behind the walls of Buckingham Palace. There were no cameras present, no public schedule noted the moment, yet people familiar with palace operations say what happened that day altered internal planning almost immediately. It began as a routine briefing inside a secure office overlooking the palace courtyard. Within minutes, it stopped being routine. The subject was Prince Harry, more specifically, a message that had arrived from California less than 48 hours earlier. According to individuals with direct knowledge of the matter, the communication was framed as an offer. But inside the palace, it did not read that way. It read as pressure. At the center of the proposal was a request to return to active royal duties under specific conditions. The timing raised concerns from the start. The king was facing health limitations. Senior members of the royal family were adjusting workloads. On the surface, the request appeared practical, but advisors reportedly noticed something else immediately. The language was transactional. Sources say the message included references to ongoing legal actions, future media exposure, and the possibility of escalation if discussions failed. This was not a simple appeal for reconciliation. It was positioned as leverage. That distinction mattered. By midday, at least 3 senior palace officials had flagged the situation as sensitive, not emotionally sensitive, institutionally sensitive. One advisor reportedly used the phrase risk containment during an internal call. Another reportedly described the offer as structurally incompatible with established royal protocol. The phrase non-starter appeared in written notes circulated later that afternoon. What complicated everything was what else was happening at the same time. Court filings involving Prince Harry were already under review by legal observers in London. Allegations tied to witness statements, document handling, and professional conduct had begun circulating quietly among legal analysts days earlier. The palace was aware of this context. That overlap changed the calculation. According to people familiar with internal discussions, the king was advised that accepting any form of return while legal questions remained unresolved could expose the monarchy to reputational and constitutional risk. This was no longer a family issue. It was an institutional one. By early evening, palace communication channels reportedly went silent. No response was sent, no counteroffer drafted, no meeting scheduled, and that silence was intentional. Because one question now dominated internal discussion. Why would someone facing mounting legal scrutiny attempt to re-enter the institution at this exact moment? And what would it cost the monarchy if that door reopened? That question set everything else in motion. To understand why that message landed so badly inside the palace, it helps to look backward, not forward. Prince Harry's departure from royal duties was never a single event. It was a sequence. A gradual unraveling that played out over nearly 4 years across interviews, court filings, contracts, and carefully timed disclosures. When Harry and Meghan stepped away in early 2020, the agreement reached at Sandringham was explicit. Senior royals would either serve the crown or pursue private interests. There would be no overlap, no hybrid arrangement. That rule was not symbolic, it was structural. It protected the monarchy from conflicts of interest, political exposure, and commercial entanglements. At first, Harry appeared to accept that reality. He relocated to North America. He signed media deals. He positioned himself as an independent voice, no longer bound by palace restraint. But within months, patterns began emerging that advisors quietly noted. Legal actions multiplied. Between 2021 and 2024, Harry initiated or joined at least 6 separate cases against British media organizations. Court filings became frequent. Public statements grew sharper. Each action framed him as a crusader against wrongdoing. Yet behind the scenes, people familiar with royal risk assessments say concerns were already forming. The issue was not the lawsuits themselves. Members of the royal family have pursued legal remedies before. The concern was tone and scope. Harry's filings reportedly relied on broad claims, reconstructed memories, and second-hand accounts stretching back more than a decade. Legal analysts began flagging inconsistencies between sworn statements and previously published material, including interviews and his own memoir. By mid-2023, internal palace briefings reportedly described the situation as volatile. That word appeared more than once. It reflected uncertainty, not judgment. Still, the warnings were logged. At the same time, Harry's public positioning grew more rigid. He spoke often about truth, accountability, and reform, but insiders say he increasingly framed disagreements as moral battles rather than disputes over fact. That distinction matters in courtrooms. Another pattern emerged around alliances. According to people familiar with the litigation strategy, Harry's legal team expanded its network aggressively. Investigators, consultants, and former industry figures were reportedly brought in to support claims. Some of those individuals carried controversial histories. That too was noted. None of this happened in isolation. Inside Kensington Palace, Prince William was pursuing the opposite approach. Fewer statements, minimal engagement, no counterattacks. Royal aides reportedly described it as deliberate containment. Do not amplify, do not respond. Let the institution outlast the noise. By late 2024, the contrast was stark. One brother was increasingly defined by court appearances and filings. The other was defined by absence from controversy. That divergence hardened views inside royal offices. Then came the health challenges within the family. Workloads shifted. Public sympathy increased. And it was during this period, according to multiple sources, that Harry's interest in returning intensified. Some interpreted it as concern, others saw calculation. The timing raised eyebrows. Legal exposure was growing, costs were rising, and the protections once provided by the Crown were no longer automatic. By the time the January message arrived, it did not land in a vacuum. It landed on top of years of accumulated concern, documented patterns, and unresolved questions. And that history shaped how every word was read. What shifted the situation from uncomfortable to serious was not the message itself. It was what palace officials were reviewing at the same time. According to people familiar with the matter, the central concern was not public perception. It was legal exposure. In the final week of December 2025, filings connected to one of Prince Harry's ongoing cases were circulated among legal observers in London. These were not new lawsuits. They were supplemental materials, additions, clarifications, and in at least 2 instances, revisions to prior statements. That detail mattered. Sources say the revisions involved timelines, communications, and the role of third parties. On paper, they appeared minor, dates adjusted, language refined. But when compared against earlier filings and public interviews, inconsistencies became harder to dismiss. By January 3rd, several legal analysts had reportedly flagged the same issue independently. The concern was not that errors existed. Errors happen. The concern was that the errors appeared patterned, repeated shifts in narrative emphasis, subtle recharacterizations, and an increasing reliance on intermediary witnesses rather than direct knowledge. This is where the scrutiny intensified. According to individuals with access to the review process, one witness statement became a focal point. It was attributed to a private investigator who had been involved in evidence collection tied to historical media practices. That investigator later disputed parts of the statement bearing his name. He did not challenge the entire document. He challenged specific sections, language, assertions, context. The allegation, according to reports, was that portions of the statement did not reflect his recollection or consent. That alone raised procedural questions, but it did not stop there. Legal representatives for the witness reportedly requested accommodations typically reserved for high-risk situations. Remote testimony, concealed location, limited disclosure of personal details. These requests are uncommon in civil cases. When they appear, they draw attention. By January 7th, conversations inside royal legal advisory circles had shifted tone. The phrase potential exposure was reportedly used, not exposure for Harry personally. Exposure for the institution if proximity was re-established prematurely. There was also concern about association. Court records indicated that individuals assisting the legal effort included figures previously convicted in unrelated cases involving unlawful media conduct. Their involvement was legal, but it was controversial. To palace risk advisors, the optics were alarming. A royal figure positioning himself as a reformer while relying on consultants with documented histories of misconduct created a contradiction that would be difficult to defend publicly. This is where authority entered the conversation. According to people familiar with the situation, briefings reference standards typically applied by senior courts and regulatory bodies, the expectation of credibility, the intolerance for ambiguity in sworn testimony, the consequences of misrepresentation. No formal accusation had been made. That distinction was emphasized repeatedly. But advisors warned that if contradictions were exposed under cross-examination, the consequences could escalate quickly. That is when the January message was reevaluated through a different lens, not as reconciliation, as timing. The question being asked internally was no longer why Harry wanted back in. It was whether the request was designed to regain institutional cover before legal pressure intensified. Once that possibility was raised, everything changed. Once legal exposure became part of the internal discussion, other details that had once seemed isolated began lining up. This is where advisors say the situation stopped looking accidental and started looking patterned. According to people familiar with the timeline, this was not the first time Prince Harry's public actions appeared to coincide with moments of heightened legal or financial pressure. Similar overlaps had occurred before. Each time there was an external stressor. Each time, a shift in strategy followed. One example surfaced from mid-2023. That summer, as one lawsuit stalled and legal costs reportedly increased, Harry gave a high-profile interview reframing his role as a reluctant warrior forced into battle. The message softened public perception briefly. Then filings resumed. Insiders later described it as a pressure release cycle. Escalate publicly, reposition emotionally, return to court. A similar pattern appeared again in late 2024. Documents tied to another case reportedly triggered concern among legal analysts about evidentiary thresholds. Within weeks, new partnerships were announced. New advisors appeared. The narrative shifted again. This repetition did not go unnoticed. By January 2026, Palace advisors were mapping these moments side by side. The result was uncomfortable. Each pivot followed the same structure. Legal strain, public repositioning, appeal to authority or reconciliation, then renewed confrontation. This is where secondary connections entered the picture. According to multiple sources, at least 2 individuals assisting with litigation had prior histories involving unethical media conduct. Their involvement was not hidden, it was documented, but the choice to engage them raised questions about judgment, not legality, judgment. Inside royal advisory circles, this triggered a deeper review, not of Harry's intentions but of his methods. Repeated reliance on controversial intermediaries suggested a willingness to prioritize victory over optics, over restraint, over long-term consequences. At this stage, escalation became unavoidable. The palace began consulting external legal experts, former regulatory advisors, people familiar with how senior courts assess credibility. According to those briefed on the discussions, the guidance was consistent. Courts tolerate mistakes. They do not tolerate patterns of misrepresentation. That warning carried weight. At the same time, conversations expanded beyond legal risk. Financial implications were added to the analysis. Security costs, ongoing litigation expenses, media exposure. Sources say estimates circulated placing annual personal security costs in the United States at several $1 million. That burden alone reshaped incentives. When advisors layered financial pressure on top of legal exposure and public repositioning, the picture sharpened. The return request no longer looked spontaneous, it looked strategic. This is when the internal classification shifted, from concern to containment. According to people familiar with palace protocol, once a situation reaches that stage, engagement becomes dangerous. Silence becomes policy, distance becomes protection. And that silence once again spoke volumes. As details circulated quietly among legal observers and palace advisors, the public response took a noticeably different shape. There was no formal announcement, no dramatic statement from Buckingham Palace. Instead, there was absence, and that absence became its own message. Requests for clarification reportedly went unanswered. Journalists familiar with royal communication patterns noticed the shift immediately. Normally, even a denial or a brief acknowledgement would be issued to cool speculation. This time, nothing, no comment, no background briefing, no corrective language. People familiar with palace strategy say this was deliberate. Silence limits liability, it avoids contradiction, and it allows events to unfold without institutional fingerprints. Meanwhile, outside the palace walls, discussion intensified. Legal analysts began speaking more openly about risk, not about guilt, about exposure. They pointed to the complexity of the cases, the reliance on memory-heavy testimony, and the danger of narrative drift under cross-examination. According to several commentators, the margin for error was shrinking. Industry figures also reacted quietly at first. Invitations reportedly slowed. Appearances became less frequent. Several organizations that had previously aligned with Harry's advocacy work adopted a wait-and-see posture. This was not rejection, it was caution. The most notable response, however, came from those closest to the monarchy. Prince William's approach remained unchanged. No response, no visible reaction. That consistency carried weight. To those familiar with royal signaling, indifference is not passive, it is decisive. It communicates finality without confrontation. Catherine's public appearances continued with measured calm. According to observers, the contrast was striking. While legal debates unfolded elsewhere, the future leadership of the monarchy projected stability. That image mattered. Then there was the silence from Harry's own camp. No rebuttal addressing witness concerns. No clarification regarding document revisions. No explanation of associations with controversial figures. Despite multiple opportunities, no comprehensive response emerged. That absence did not go unnoticed. When accusations are unfounded, public figures typically respond quickly. They correct the record, they push back. Here there was restraint. According to people familiar with the situation, legal counsel advised against public engagement. Any statement could be used later. Every word would matter. That strategy may have been prudent legally, but reputationally it created a vacuum, and vacuums fill themselves. By late January, discussions had shifted again, this time toward consequences. Once the situation moved from observation to consequence, the stakes rose quickly. This was no longer about optics or family tension. It was about risk management at the highest level. Legal experts began outlining scenarios that had previously seemed remote. According to people familiar with those discussions, one concern dominated: testimony. Prince Harry was expected to give evidence in at least one proceeding. That reality changed everything. Courts operate on precision. Inconsistencies that might pass in interviews do not survive cross-examination. Every prior statement becomes relevant. Every published word becomes material. In the United Kingdom, giving false testimony is not symbolic. It is criminal. Perjury carries real penalties. That fact alone elevated internal anxiety. Advisors reportedly warned that even unintentional misstatements could trigger cascading consequences. At the same time, constitutional implications entered the analysis. Prince Harry remains a counselor of state. That role is not ceremonial. It carries legal authority to act on behalf of the monarch under specific conditions. The position assumes credibility, stability, and trust. If a counselor of state becomes entangled in allegations involving misrepresentation or procedural misconduct, the situation becomes untenable. According to individuals familiar with palace legal advice, this scenario was discussed explicitly. Financial implications also loomed large. Ongoing litigation is expensive. Security costs remain substantial. Sources estimate annual personal protection expenses in the United States alone could exceed several $million. Without institutional support, those costs fall entirely on the individual. This context reframed the January request yet again. The desire to return no longer appeared symbolic. It appeared practical. Institutional affiliation brings protection, it brings cover, it shifts burdens. Parliamentary attention followed. According to observers in Westminster, conversations began emerging about legislative authority over titles. A proposal already existed. The threshold for action depends on public sentiment and perceived institutional threat. That possibility unsettled palace advisors, not because they feared accountability, because parliamentary intervention removes control. Once the matter leaves the family and enters statute, outcomes become unpredictable. This is why distance mattered. Association creates exposure. Silence creates separation. By the end of January, the internal assessment was stark. Engagement now could create irreversible damage. Waiting carried risk, but acting carried more. The safest path, according to multiple sources, was non-engagement. As of now, the situation remains unresolved but not unclear. Lines have been drawn even if they have not been announced publicly. The palace has not issued a statement. No meeting has been scheduled. No pathway back has been outlined. That absence speaks louder than any formal declaration. According to people familiar with ongoing monitoring, legal proceedings continue at a measured pace. No dramatic developments, no sudden resolutions, just process. That in itself creates pressure. Time is not neutral in legal matters. It exposes patterns, it tests consistency. Several questions now dominate private discussions. Why did the request to return arrive precisely when legal scrutiny intensified? Why were revisions made to witness materials so late in the process? Why involve consultants whose histories complicate credibility rather than reinforce? There is also the question of silence. No denial has been issued addressing concerns about document handling. No clarification has been offered regarding witness accommodations. Legal counsel remains quiet. That restraint may be strategic, but it also allows assumptions to harden. Insiders say attention is now focused on upcoming testimony. That moment will be decisive. It will either confirm alignment or expose contradiction. There is no middle ground. Another unresolved element involves personal dynamics. Prince Harry's public positioning has become increasingly solitary. Former allies appear cautious. Institutional support is absent. Even familiar joint branding has receded from view. That isolation carries consequences. Meanwhile, the monarchy continues forward. Public duties proceed, continuity is emphasized, the contrast remains deliberate. People watching closely say the next phase will not be driven by emotion. It will be driven by record, transcripts, evidence, statements made under oath. Once that phase begins, control shifts entirely. In stories like this, the most revealing moments often come not from what is said, but from what is withheld. Doors do not always slam shut. Sometimes they are simply left unopened, and over time, the silence becomes permanent. Prince Harry believed leverage would force engagement, that a well-timed appeal layered with implication might reopen a role he once walked away from. But institutions do not respond to pressure the way individuals do. They respond to risk. Every choice made over the past several years has narrowed options. Each public disclosure, each legal filing, each alliance. Together, they formed a trajectory that is difficult to reverse, not because forgiveness is impossible, but because exposure is. The monarchy does not need to argue, it only needs to endure. Time favors structures, not strategies. While legal processes move forward, the institution remains still. That contrast is intentional. What happens next will not unfold in interviews or statements. It will unfold in courtrooms, in transcripts, in moments where precision matters more than intention. Those moments cannot be managed by narrative. People familiar with institutional decision-making say one principle guides everything now. Distance protects continuity. Engagement creates vulnerability. That is why the door remains closed. Whether it stays that way depends not on appeals but on outcomes. Outcomes that cannot be spun, outcomes that cannot be delayed. And as those watching closely understand, once certain thresholds are crossed, there is no quiet way back.